And we're live. Welcome to another GraphQL live stream, everyone. Thanks for joining our Thursday session. This time we have invited a special guest, Rachel from Clover. Welcome, Rachel. For this edition, you'll need a few links to get started with and follow us along. So please find them in the comment section and in the description down below. I'm just adding them right now.
Awesome.
And Amelia.
Thanks so much, Angie. Me and Rachel got to meet a year ago at the Jamstack Conf in San Francisco, where Rachel led an awesome content modeling workshop at our Contentful headquarters in San Francisco. It was really fun, and I was super excited about the workshop. We also did a Clover webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about auto-generating Typescript for your content model, and Rachel has prepared a lot of awesome resources. So if you look right down at our live stream and you look underneath, all of the links you need are there. We have, you can go to the GitHub, you can check out Rachel's Twitter and follow her. You can also look at her slides so that you can follow along by just copying and pasting anything you see. So we feel like this is going to be a really interactive session. We hope that you code along with us. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer them in real time, coding your answers in real time. So thank you so much, Rachel. We are so excited to have you today.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. The last webinar we did was a lot of fun, so I'm glad we get to do this again. So my name is Rachel Church, and I'm a senior software engineer at Clover. And Clover is a point of sale system, and so you've probably gone to a coffee shop, scanned your credit card, didn't realize it was a Clover device. I work on the website, and so Clover actually consumes Contentful for a number of our different websites. And the one that I worked on the most is our Help Center. And so we consume the Contentful GraphQL API, and I think we started utilizing it about a year ago. So a lot of what I cover in the slide deck is things that I've learned from using Create React App, Contentful, and GraphQL with Typescript. So today we're going to be covering how to use Codegen, which is a command line tool to generate Typescript definitions automatically from our Contentful content model. This means that if you change your content model in Contentful, you can rerun the Typescript definition generation and it will automatically map to the changes in your content model. We're going to be using Apollo client in our Create React app in conjunction with Typescript. So I'll show how those things kind of go hand in hand. And then even if you're not familiar with React or Apollo or Typescript at all, there you can use Codegen to improve writing GraphQL queries inside of your IDE. And so again, here's the links. So there's going to be a lot of boilerplate code setting up this command line tool, so I highly recommend you have the slide deck. That way you can follow along and just copy and paste, because there's going to be a lot of typing otherwise. And the starter code has different branches for each of the little milestones we're getting to, and the upper left corner will be the branch name that we're working towards getting to that little checkpoint. So backing up a little bit, this talk is all about TypeScript, but very high level TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. And so anything you can do in ES5, anything you could do in ES6 JavaScript syntax, you can do in TypeScript. TypeScript just adds a little more on top. And so if you take a JavaScript file and you rename it to a TypeScript file and you compile it, you can still run that. You might get some type errors, but there's nothing stopping you from still running that JavaScript file. And the biggest benefits of TypeScript is it helps you catch bugs. It helps you maintain your code and it makes it more readable for others. TypeScript is a static type checker. And so within your IDE, without even running it, you could be aware of potential bugs if you're accessing a property that doesn't exist, or you have a variable that you think is a string, but it actually ends up being an object. It can tell you within your IDE. And the type definitions end up kind of being the documentation for your code. And so it's a lot easier to maintain and refactor later. So I personally don't think I'd ever write another application without using TypeScript. So without further ado, let's get into it. So Amelia and I both have my Summer of GraphQL code checked out. So we're going to be coding along to this. The master branch is the starting point here. So this is what the app looks like. And this GraphQL schema that we're using is from Amelia's blog post, Getting Started with Contentful and GraphQL. So the star of the show here is really Cowboy.
He's very good. This is him. Famous Mr. Cowboy, who chews on all toys, including shoes. He really loves toys. I like to buy him as much toys as humanly possible so he stops eating shoes. But, you know, here you go. Pay attention, cowboy.
So this is the content model that Amelia set up for Cowboy and tracking Cowboy's dog toys. And so we're going to use GraphQL to explore this really quick. So GraphQL is an IDE for GraphQL, and so it introspects, and so it's asking Contentful, what does the content model look like? And it allows us to kind of explore the data that we can fetch. So I can see here that a dog toy has a property toy name, that's a string, a toy photo, puppy photo, estimated price, and link to buy. And it looks like all of these fields are optional because they don't have the exclamation mark after. Let's do a quick query here. Let's query for a dog toy collection. And we're going to get the items. And from the dog toy type, let's grab the toy name and estimated price for all. So it looks like there's 3 items here: dental chew, my shoes, and cactus. And so that's what we're seeing in this application. So connecting to our graph or our Contentful space inside of the sample code, I have a .env file with these environment variables. And so if you're following along, you can leave these the same, or you can change them to use your own content model. It's up to you, but we're going to be referencing these environment variables in the slides going forward. So if you want to check out what we're working towards, we're on branch step 1, add TypeScript. But if you want to just keep following along, you can stay on the master branch and make these changes incrementally. So our Create React App project doesn't come with TypeScript out of the box, and so we're going to add TypeScript. And I have this step in the slides just to show you how easy it is to add it. So checking out our code here. So this project, it looks very familiar if you're familiar with Create React App. We have the app.jsx file, we have our index.js file, and our package.json here. So in the terminal, we're just going to copy and paste this command. I'm using yarn. Feel free to use npm. It's up to you. And while TypeScript is installing here, let's take a look at our app file. Well, first off, there's only 2 steps to installing TypeScript. You install the dependency and then you rename your files. Right now, app.jsx, we just need to rename to app.tsx. And then index.js, we need to rename to index.tsx. And that's all we need to do. Next time you run the app, it's going to tell you that it's text TypeScript, and it's going to auto create a tsconfig file for us. And so this file just popped up. And so this is telling Webpack the rules for compiling TypeScript. You don't have to worry about that too much, but just be aware that it magically happened for us. So we already have type errors here. It's telling us that inside of our app.tsx file, there's an issue. It's saying on line 34. So in my IDE here, I see, here's my app code. So I have my query defined here at the top. Here's my get toys query. And then I'm using React state to store that information. I initialize data to be undefined. I initialize loading to be true, and error is undefined. And then inside of my use effect block, so when the component mounts, I set loading to true and I clear the rest of the data. And then I use a fetch call. So I'm providing, this is my GraphQL endpoint that's just up here at the top. So this is just using the space ID and environment variables we have in that env file. And I'm making a fetch command, and I'm giving it the query that we have at the top of this file, this get toys query that we just did in GraphQL. And then I take my response and I set it into state, and then I have some logic for catching errors. And then down here, we're just looping over the toys and generating a list of them. So this is what's represented here. But we have to fix our type error so it runs. So it's complaining on this line that dog toy collection doesn't exist on type never. And so it looks like data it's saying is undefined. And so TypeScript is trying to guess from my code here what the structure of this data looks like. And it's guessing that all it knows is data is undefined here. It doesn't know anything else. So we have to tell it what this is actually going to look like. And so the the first argument here of useState is I can tell it what my data structure looks like. And so I'm going to create a type inline here, and I'm going to say that it has the property data. And we need to create a type to represent this. So I use the keyword type, and I'm going to say dog toy. And this is going to match this dog toy, the fields that we're fetching for the dog toy. So we have the sys field, which is a single property ID that we're requesting of type string. And then we have our toy name, which is type string. We have our estimated price, which is a JavaScript number. And then we have our toy photo, which has the URL, which is type string. But if you're familiar with GraphQL, you know GraphQL returns the data in the exact structure that you request it. And so we have to do a little bit more to represent this structure here. So let's make another type called dog toy collection. And so this is going to mirror our query. So we have dog toy collection. Inside of that has the items array. And each item is of type dog toy. So now our data is represented in TypeScript. So now we can consume that here. We can say the data that we're getting back is going to be a dog toy collection. Our loading flag is going to be a Boolean. And our error is, we're not sure what it is, so we're just going to call it unknown. And then all of these are potentially undefined. So in TypeScript, that's the question mark indicator. It just means that it's potentially undefined. So now if I save it, it looks like it's happy again. And there we go, our app is working again. And so I kind of break what we just did down in the slides. So in the slides, if you just want to copy and paste, feel free to do that here. And so this is just mirroring exactly what we did. So we just did all of that manually though. And the point of this is to have Codegen do a lot of the work for us. So what does that look like? First thing we need to do is install our Codegen dependencies here. And we're using the GraphQL plugin to Codegen, and we're using the TypeScript plugin. So I'm just going to copy and paste this into my IDE. And while that's installing, what we're going to need to do is configure Codegen to tell it what we want it to generate. And so we do that with a Codegen YML file. And so we're going to create this Codegen YML file at the root of our.
We have sorry to bother. I think we have a quick question from our audience member, Stefan, who wanted to ask you again about the question mark. And you mentioned that that means it's undefined. What is that?
This is TypeScript syntax. And so this is just saying that the data object here could be dog toy collection or undefined. And it's completely equivalent to if I did something like this. It means the same thing. The question mark is just kind of the shorthand syntax for it.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to be creating a configuration for our Codegen. And so we're going to create a Codegen YML file at the root of our project. And it's going to have these fields. And so overwrite true means every time we run Codegen, we want to delete the old ones and create new files. We're telling it where to look for the schema. And so this is the Contentful GraphQL endpoint. And it's using our environment variables here. So it's going to use the space ID in the URL and the environment name. And then in the headers, we need to make sure we provide that API key so we can actually get through to Contentful. And so we're telling Codegen that we're going to be generate a single file that we're calling schema.ts. You can call this anything you want. It doesn't need to be called schema.ts. And we're using a single plugin right now called TypeScript. So if you're on slide 11, you can just copy and paste this into your Codegen YML file and save that. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to add a script to our package.json so it's easy to run this over and over again. I'm going to call the script name yarngen, but you can call it whatever you want. And so we're calling the command line tool, and we're telling it where to look for a configuration file. And we're requiring the .env script. That way it can read our .env file. So I'm just going to put this in my package JSON. Didn't copy all of it. And then now if I open up my terminal, I can run this command. I can say yarn gen, and it's going to create that schema file that we told it to. So instead of source, here's our schema. Now, one more thing while we're sitting on the package JSON file is every time I run start or every time I run build, I want Codegen to ask Contentful, what does the content model look like? This way, if I'm the engineer writing code and the content team changes the content model, I'll be notified as soon as I run yarn gen that what my code is doesn't match what actually lives in Contentful. So I'm going to say run yarn gen. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and check in. Amelia, how are we doing?
How's everyone doing? I don't see any comments from the audience, but feel free to comment if you're confused. We're still, let's see what slide number we're on is
13 out of 39.
13 out of 39. And if you would like to jump to any slide, you can always push Option G, and you can get a grid mode, and so you can look for, there you go, that's a great example there, Rachel. So you can jump to whatever slide that we're on if you've missed a couple or if you need to go back.
Yeah, thank you. That's some good context. So now this next step is we just need to run our script. So I just ran yarn gen. And so now we have our...
We have a question now from Sonia. Where should I put my Codegen file?
At the root of your project. So it should be outside of the source directory here.
Great.
But you could technically list it anywhere. You just have to make sure you tell Codegen where to look for it.
That's a great tip. Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks, Sonia, for the question.
So what just happened, and we're about to open the generated file, is so it was able to query Contentful and ask it what content types live in Contentful. And so we know there's only one. We know there's just the dog toy. And so in here, there should be our dog toy type. It's all the way down here on line 239. So notice how this dog toy type looks very familiar. It looks very similar to the one that we just manually created. And same with the dog toy collection. It's very similar to what we just did manually. So now we can just delete the manual one we created and utilize this one instead. So I'm going back to our app.tsx file, and I'm saying we don't need this dog toy type anymore. We're just going to import the one from our schema file. I'm going to import that. But notice how the dog toy collection type is slightly different. So we are querying on collection, and if you're familiar with GraphQL, you know you could call this whatever you want. And so Codegen isn't making any assumptions on what you're calling that. It has just kind of that nested level, so the items. So we're going to use this, and we know that dog toy collection is type dog toy collection, but now we have to rename our type so it doesn't collide. So I'm going to call this dog toy query. I'm going to import this type here. And then now we just need to reuse this type here. So we reduced about 10 lines of code here. And if you're following along in the slides, what I just did is reflected in the slides. You can see how we changed our type to use the generated types. But we're still trying to manually create types. Codegen can do some more work for us. And we can make it a little bit smarter by utilizing Apollo in conjunction with Codegen. And Apollo client, if you've never used it before, its biggest benefit is it allows caching of your GraphQL queries. Browsers are very intelligent in terms of caching, but when you have nested queries, like for example, if I had a content model that had blog posts and a blog post links to an author linked to a photo, you have these nested IDs inside of there, but the browser is going to cache only the top level request. It's not smart enough to cache all of those nested things. So Apollo client has logic that will go through and iterate through that tree structure to add caching to the browser. Apollo client also provides React hooks that will reduce some of the boilerplate. So instead of us having to manually call fetch, we can use the Apollo use query hook. And then it can actually do validation of our GraphQL queries. It can parse the string and tell us what's actually happening.
Hey, Rachel, we have a question from Yan. Would this still be compatible with TypeScript 3.x, for instance?
Yeah, everything here is compatible with 3.0. Codegen, if you want to use TypeScript 1.0, there's actually some extra configuration you have to do, but TypeScript 2 and 3, it's fully happy with.
Great.
But Apollo Client, if you've never used it before, it's an open source library that just handles state management for any sort of GraphQL requests. And so we're not going to do too much of a deep dive. We could actually do a whole talk on Apollo if we wanted to, but we're just going to set up just very bare bones. So we're going to install Apollo Client into our application here. Oops, didn't copy it. Copy. Oh my gosh. Copy and paste, please. There we go. So while that's installing, it actually looks like we have some type errors here. I didn't check our application after I made those changes. It's telling us that the toy object is possibly null. And so what this is doing is Codegen is actually correct. It asks Contentful, what does the content model look like and what are the possible values? And it's telling us that the toy could come back null. And this would happen if you had some nested query and I said, give me all blog posts that link to a dog toy. If one of those entries in Contentful is in draft state and I'm using, and you're linking to a draft entry, it would come back null. But we don't have that case. So we're just going to simplify this and we're going to say, don't worry, we know that none of these are going to be null. So we're going to say these are always just going to be dog toy. And it looks like we still have an error down here. It's saying that the toy photo is possibly null. This is TypeScript being correct again, because the toy photo is optional. And so in Contentful, if Amelia got a new toy for Cowboy, it's possible that that toy doesn't have a photo. And so our code here isn't really correct. So let's fix this by adding a conditional statement, and we'll say we only want to show the photo if one exists. So I'm going to use optional chaining to do this. If you're not familiar with the syntax, don't worry about it. You can Google optional chaining after this if you're interested. Okay, so now it looks like our TypeScript is happy. Let's check our app. Great, the app is still working. Looks like Apollo finished installing. So now we're going to set it up. So we're going to open up our index.txt file. And in our current code, we're just going to add in the configuration for Apollo client. So we're going to utilize the environment variables that we have set up. We're going to tell Apollo client what the URL is to query from Contentful. We're going to give it our API key, and we're going to tell it to initiate a new cache. In React apps, in-memory cache is common, but if you wanted a deep dive in Apollo, there's a lot of different configurations options we could use here. So I'm going to copy this into my index.txt file. Oops, it looks like I got some extra stuff here. So then we just need to use the Apollo provider, and the Apollo provider is going to provide the React context so that any nested components underneath it can use the use query hook. Okay, and this is all we need to do to configure Apollo. Now we can just go straight into using it. So we're going to go back to our app file here, and we're going to replace our custom fetch use effect with the hook that Apollo provides for us. So we can actually delete this entire code block. We don't need any of this anymore.
That's really cool.
There's nothing I love more than deleting unnecessary code.
Totally. That's awesome.
And the variable names that we have here, these are the same ones that Apollo is going to be giving us. And so I'm going to call use query, and you give it the name of the query that you're using. So we're calling get toys query. So we can delete all of this now. And you need to tell let me import this. So we're importing use query from Apollo client. And it's complaining. It's telling us argument of type string is not expected. It needs to be a document type or type document node. So kind of what I said earlier about how Apollo goes to the tree structure of your GraphQL query. It does that because it parses your query into an AST tree. And so we do that by using a helper that it provides. The GQL helper is a template literal tag, and it's going to take the string that we have and parse it into a JavaScript object that represents the hierarchy of all the fields that we're fetching. And this is what allows Apollo to cache your queries and do the validation logic. So we're just going to apply this. Was there a question, Amelia?
No, I just thought that's a really great explanation of what Apollo is doing right there. Thank you.
So that's all we need to do to adjust our query. Now you'll see that TypeScript is happy. It's Apollo's accepting our get toys query. But we want to tell Apollo what type we're getting back, because right now TypeScript is saying that this data could be anything. It has no idea what shape this is. So we're going to tell Apollo that it's going to be the shape of a dog toy query. And now if we go to our app, it still works. So we're doing something right. But let's complicate this a little bit more. So this is a simple query, but what if you want to use variables? What if you want to do something a little bit harder? So let's change our query to only give us toys under some maximum price. So let's go back over to GraphQL. And let's change this. Let's say we want to provide to our query some maximum price. And then if we look at the dog toy collection here, we see that we could add a where clause of type dog toy filter. And we want to filter by the estimated price being less than some value. So it looks like I can use this one here. So I want to say where, am I doing that right? I've mixed up if when I need a colon and when I don't need a colon. Dog toy collection. Where?
Luckily, it yells at you if you do it wrong, and then you can which is nice.
I'm missing a curly brace. There you go. Whoops. Oh no. Dang it. I'm gonna cheat. There we go. So here's our query. So we're saying, give me all the dog toys where the estimated price is less than some variable that we're passing in. And in GraphQL, you can click this little query variables tab, and you can say, I'm passing in one variable, max price, and I'm going to enter the value 40. So now if I run this, this is what Contentful is giving us back. Looks like it filtered out the third one. So now we only have the two.
Which is great, because I really don't want him to eat my shoes. So
only things under $40, please.
I agree with this query.
So we're just going to copy and paste our query into our code here. And so now we need to actually pass in this value. Oops, I forgot to copy this part. Okay. And I'm going to say that this variable is required. So the exclamation mark in GraphQL means that this has to be provided. So with Apollo, the second argument of the use query is the options, and you can give it the variables here. So we have one variable called max price, and I'm just going to say always filter by $40. So if we save this and go back to our app, Amelia's shoes have been filtered out of the list.
Yes, thank you. You've solved my puppy training problems.
But if I was typing really fast and I actually did price instead of max price, my IDE is not warning me. It doesn't know what variable is coming here. So the second argument of use query, you can specify what variables are allowed. So let's make another type called dog toy query variables. And we're always going to have a max price, which is of type number. And it's required because if we add the question mark, it means it's optional variable, but we're making it required. So that's the second argument of use query. And now it's warning us. It's saying that this variable is not expected. So we fix it. And now we're good. So our app is still happy here. So again, like everything that we just did is here in the code. So if you wanted to copy and paste or jump through, we're on branch, step 4, add variable. So that's where we're at right now if you wanted to skip ahead. But we're still having to manually create some of these types. Let's make Codegen do some more of this work for us.
Awesome.
So Codegen can actually look at the GraphQL queries we're having in our code and generate types directly from them. So let's add this plugin. And while that's installing, let's configure Codegen. So we're going to open up our Codegen file again. And so this is what it looks like now. But the changes we need to use is on our schema.ts file, we need to add the new plugin that we're going to be utilizing it. And we need to tell Codegen where to look for our GraphQL queries. And our GraphQL queries right now are living inside of our source directory in any Typescript file. So let's add this to our Codegen file. Copy and paste. And then we're adding our plugin. So now all I need to do is run yarn-gen or restart my app. And if I open up the schema file, I expect to have a type for both of these. And so I'm going to search for a variable name max price instead of the schema file. And there we go. Here is our variables type, but it has a pretty gross name here. It's called unnamed one query variables. So let's fix that. So inside of our app, our query that we're using is unnamed. So let's give this a name. Let's just say get toys under price. Let's save our file and run yarn-gen again. So this time, now we have a nicer looking name. So let's utilize this. So instead of our app tsx file, we no longer need to manually declare these types here. We can remove those entirely. And then we're going to be using these two types provided for us. And make sure we import these. Remove some unused imports. And make sure our app still works. Great, it does.
Awesome.
But we're still doing a little bit of boilerplate here. And again, if you're following along these changes, you can copy and paste from the slides. But we're kind of following the same pattern. So imagine if we had a ton of different queries. We're going to have these query strings declared all over the place, kind of following the same pattern. And then we're going to call use query from Apollo. We're going to provide in the types that's auto-generated for us. And so this query and these types are linked. If I renamed this, these are going to change. And so that's a little bit of a headache. I want to be able to rename this and not have to worry about changing both of the variable names and importing. So there's an Apollo plugin we can use with Codegen, and it will do a lot of this stuff for us. So we don't even have to worry about it. So let's add this to our project.
Nice. That's really great. And
Codegen
in our audience have any questions? We assume you're following along and you have lots of opportunities to check out the slide deck. Obviously, when we end this stream, you can also rewind immediately and go back and watch it again, any part that you missed. But we're also here to answer your questions, so feel free to chime in. All right, continue, Rachel. Thank you.
No, yeah, thank you for reminding people. I want to make sure I'm going slow enough that people can follow along. So the next step here is we need to configure the plugin that we just installed. And so this one's super easy. We just need to add it to the plugins array of the file we're already generating. Throw that into our configuration file, save it, and now we can run yarn-gen.
Rachel, would you like to give a little summary of where we've come so far for anyone who may have joined a little bit late or kind of wants to know where we are and where we've been?
Sure thing. So we started with a pretty simple React application created from Create React App. And so this is what it looks like now. And so these cards here are being fetched from Amelia's content model within Contentful. and we're using the GraphQL API. But the GraphQL types, we're adding TypeScript type safety around them. And so right now within our app TSX file, we have strong type safety around the response from this GraphQL query fetching toys. And just to demonstrate the benefit of TypeScript a little bit, let's say inside of my JSX here, let's say I wanted to create this from scratch here. So I had, I wanted to display the toy name. I can see here all the different fields available to me. And before with the JavaScript app, it had no idea what kind of fields were coming back. And so now I can have toy name. And if I had a typo, my ID is going to tell me. So before I even run the app, I don't have to wait and see if the query fails. I know what I'm getting back.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you for pointing that out, Rachel.
Okay, so we just added the TypeScript React Apollo plugin. So we're using 3 different plugins in our Codegen configuration. And so we just ran Codegen. So if we open up our source schema file, we're going to have some hooks generated for us. And so our query is called get toys under price. And so it's going to be called use get toys under price. And so we can just copy this name and replace our query here. So all of this manual stuff we're doing here, we no longer need to do. So I'm going to use this instead. And we don't even need to provide the query to it because it knows it already that it's linked to that query. And then we just need to provide our variables. And then now we should be good to go after importing it. And so we don't need this constant anymore. I think I'm missing a comma or something. Oh, it's in a curly brace. There we go. So our app is still working as expected. So summary of what we just did here is here's our current code. We just utilized the hook that's generated for us. But now we kind of have this GraphQL query sitting in our app TSX file that we're not really utilizing. It's kind of awkward just having it thrown in here at the top. So let's do a little bit of separation of concern and let's take our query and put it in a GraphQL file. So I'm going to create a new GraphQL file in the source directory, and I'm going to call get toys under price.graphql. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this whole query from my TypeScript file. I'm going to throw it into my GraphQL file. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to update our Codegen. So we're telling Codegen that we're looking for GraphQL queries within the source directory inside of our TypeScript files. So we just need to tell it that we're looking in an array of different places. We're going to also be looking inside of our GraphQL file. So I'm going to copy this config, add that secondary location for it to search. So now if I run yarn gen, we're actually not going to see any change. It's going to see our query now lives in a GraphQL file, but the actual generated schema is going to be the same. It's just pulling our query from a different location here. And so now our app should still be working because this use get toys under price query is automatically connected with that get toys under price query file. So if I look at our app, everything is still happy here.
Nice.
So if I open up this GraphQL file though, and if you kind of noticed earlier when I was using that string tag GQL, then my ID is complaining. It doesn't know what these fields are that we're fetching from. And so if I was writing a query in here, I'm not going to get any autocomplete. We can use Codegen to generate a GraphQL file that our IDE can read from. That way we can get autocomplete and just better checking within our IDE. So if you're not comfortable with React, you're not comfortable with Apollo, let's say you want to use Angular, this is the one thing I want you to get from this talk. You can use Codegen just to do this one piece that will help develop inside of your IDE. And so we're going to use another plugin called Schema AST. So we're going to install this in our project. copy paste. There we go. And so while that's installing, let's configure our Codegen file. So we're generating a new file here. We're generating a schema GraphQL file, and this is independent from TypeScript and independent from React. This is just helpful for any sort of GraphQL development that you're doing inside of your IDE. So we're calling the file schema.graphql, and it's going to be generated at the root of our project, and we're using a single plugin, schema AST. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing, plop it in here, and it's done installing. So now I can run yarn gen. It's already done. And so here's our new file here, the schema GraphQL. And you'll see it's just a direct representation of what's defined inside of Contentful.
Wow, that's great.
If I open up this file here, I have a plugin installed. I'm using IntelliJ, which is a JetBrains product. So same sort of thing if you're using WebStorm. And so I have this JavaScript GraphQL plugin installed. And so it's going to allow me to do this thing I'm about to show you. But if you're using VS Code, there's an equivalent one for VS Code called GraphQL extension. And the GraphQL community as a whole has a common configuration standard that they're trying to propagate. And if you click either of these links, you can look at the standard. And so the end goal here is I can create a configuration for my IDE for GraphQL, and it could work in any other IDE. The JetBrains plugin is still only supporting v2, while the VS Code plugin is supporting configuration standard v3. So I'm going to use standard v2. That way, anyone else that checks out my code, it'll apply to either VS Code or JetBrains. So inside of this file here, I was prompted to, I think I already had a schema. So it should prompt me to create a configuration file for this. There it goes. No GraphQL config file found. Create GraphQL config. I said, yes, thank you. I would like a GraphQL config file at the root of my project. So this is the v2 standardization that I was just talking about. And I'm going to call this my Contentful dog toy schema. And I'm telling it to look for a file called schema.graphql. So this is a file that we just auto-created using Codegen. And we're going to tell it which extensions to look for. And so we're going to need to paste in our Contentful string here. I tried getting it to read the environment variables when I was practicing earlier, but this plugin isn't there yet with reading those queries. So we have to just copy paste in. So I'm going to grab it from here. And grab the values for those environment variables. The space ID, and I'm going to default to using the master branch, so I don't need to specify that. And then we need our header so we can authenticate. So we need to grab this here, this bearer token. And then I need to grab the actual API key for my env file. And then surround this with quotes. And now, if I go back to my query, it's happy. All the squigglies have gone away. And now I'm getting validation. So now my query, my IDE is going to work just like GraphQL. So in the beginning, when we were showing how to use GraphQL as a tool, I can do that within my IDE. I can even run this query here. So I can toggle the variable editor, and I can say I want my max price variable to be $40. Oops. I'm getting connection refused. Oops. There we go. So here's our query results. Here's our 2 items. So now my IDE works, can do the validation for me. And if I had my query back in this file here, it'll also validate anything surrounded in the GQL helper. My IDE will be aware of. So we're at the end of kind of those different branches, but I have one last branch called finalApp, where I kind of use some other Codegen plugins, just to kind of show what you can do with the app and where you can take it from here. I'm using these two, so I just kind of want to touch on some of my favorites. There's a ton of different Codegen plugins. There's so much more you could do with this, but the ones I wanted to point out is there's the add plugin, which allows you to inject in some custom code to the output files. And so this is useful if at the top of, let's say, our schema.ts file, if we didn't want ESLint to check this file. At the very top, we could inject in ESLint ignore. There's the fragment matcher plugin, which can help optimize Apollo client, and it's necessary if you have complex interfaces and unions in your queries, because this fragment matcher will produce an object that represents the polymorphic relationships between the different nested entries. And so Apollo client uses that for its caching. So I have an example of using both of these in the finalApp branch. Other notable plugins, though, is if you're not using Contentful and if you're using GraphQL to write your own node service API, the Typescript resolvers plugin will generate types around to resolvers. And then there's the named operations object, which is useful if you're calling a GraphQL API and using mutations. If you're using Contentful, you're not going to be using mutations unless you're combining different GraphQL schemas. But these ones are notable if you want to dive into the docs and read more. But that's it in terms of like the final walkthrough. I know that was a lot, but does anyone have any questions?
That was so great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And, we're happy to answer anyone's questions. We can live code some of your suggestions or comments. You're also welcome to, as soon as we're finished with this live stream, to go and rewind and go past and pause at any point so that you can follow along. All the resources that you would need in order to code along with this tutorial are right there in the description of this live stream. If you just scroll down a little bit, you'll see all the different branches for each step of the tutorial. You'll see a link to the slide deck that Rachel shared with all of the links, as well as some of the commands that you might need or the code that you might need. You can just copy and paste, just as you saw Rachel do it previously, just a couple seconds ago. You can do the same thing. If you were doing it all along with us, that's great. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for coding along with us and hanging out with me and Anji and Rachel today on our summer of GraphQL. So I'll check really quick to see if we have any questions. Anji, do we have any questions from Periscope and Twitch?
Not that I see anything right now, but I invited everybody to add their questions to the comments and we can answer them.
Yeah, and if you think of questions later after we have, left for the day and we are no longer live, we can still answer them. Me and Anji go back and help you out and reaffirm some of those questions. So thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us and creating all of these incredible resources. This wonderful slide deck in code, which is really fun. I get to learn a whole new way of making slide decks now. And I've learned so much about TypeScript. Thank you for all of the amazing collaborations you've done with Contentful over the years. You are just a superstar. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't know if anyone noticed, we have our matching Contentful t-shirts on. And these are the t-shirts that the Contentful team had at the Jamstack.
Yeah, and we went to an ice cream social together, which was a ton of fun. We got to play in a giant sprinkle pool. And
it seems weird now with COVID.
What were we doing? Yeah, we got a lot of ice cream, so that was good. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you next time. I think we're going to continue our streamings, and we would always love to have you back, Rachel. So if you think of anything awesome that you'd love to share with our community, please let us know.
Yeah, of course. It's always great partnering with you.
Thank you so much.
And then to the audience, I'm open to answer questions. You can tweet at me or just leave a GitHub issue on other of my repos. And this slide deck is built with code. It's a Gatsby app, actually. And so it's built in a tool called mdx-slides. And so if you're curious and you want to know how I did this, there's that repo's open too.
It is really cool. I loved that repo this week. It's awesome. I want to do all my slide decks like that. You're so cool.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have an excellent Thursday and a wonderful weekend. We're almost there. All right.